Today we thank you again for joining in for another drone rights talk. And today we have and you're gonna help me with your last name here, Dr. Crystal Ste-
Steltenpohl.
Steltenpohl on transparency in qualitative research and using Dedoose for coding. So Dr. Crystal Steltenpohl is a community psychologist whose research focuses on a wide range of topics related to community well-being, such as perceptions and interactions between individuals and community-based interventions. She has conducted research and evaluation using qualitative and quantitative methodologies and data, and designed and conducted trainings for effective collaboration and communication within organizations. She's also an active advocate of the open science movement, particularly passionate about driving initiatives focused on inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. She's actively involved with the Center for Open Science and the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. So I'll pass on to you, Crystal.
All right, thanks, Suvi. Yes, that was an excellent introduction. That's me. Hi. I'm at the University of Southern Indiana, and I primarily do research on the way that people interact with and through technology. And I use a lot of mixed methods research in order to do that. So within the open science movement, I've noticed that there's kind of a relative dearth of conversations around transparency and qualitative research, at least that actively involves people who actually do qualitative research. So I'm very excited to talk to you all today about qualitative research and also the software that I use for coding, Dedoose. I don't, just as a prequel to all of this, I don't get money from them. I don't anything like that. But it's just a program that I like to use, and I've preferred it over software that I've used in the past. But before we get started, I wanted to kind of go into something that I kind of assumed whenever I was putting this together. I'm going to go into this with the assumption that you're not sharing your data. That's a pretty obvious way to have transparency, but I think that is a longer conversation that can be really done on its own. And a lot of really talented people have already started those conversations. So there's a lot of things that need to be considered whenever you're going to share your data if you're going to do it in an ethical way. So I kind of am sidestepping that conversation just a little bit because it is kind of more contentious for qualitative research, whether people feel like they should share or not share. So I'm not here to tell you to share your data or to not share your data, but like if you're going to, you really need to make sure that your participants are protected. It's really easy to go into these talks of reform with these ideas of defaults, right? So like you should always share your data, you should always share your code, you should always share your material. And I think that defaults can be good because they make decision-making processes a little bit easier, but they can also be really bad if it turns off that critical thinking process and you're not really thinking about potential downfalls to sharing your data. So Malta Elson fairly recently shared that when he goes on the OSF, the Open Science Framework, he often runs into data sets where they're open, but they're also maybe a little bit too open. You can grab people's IP addresses and their prolific IDs and stuff like that. And then there's also been some work that's been done looking at like how easy or difficult it is to re-identify people based on the data set itself, but also like outside factors. So for instance, if patients are posting in patient support forums, can that data then lead to data in other data sets, them being re-identified there? So defaults are how we get unchecked assumptions and sloppy work. So I tend to shy away from those. Share your data if you can, but really think about like what the best way to do that is going to be. Um, But the lucky thing about working with qualitative work is that even if you're not sharing data, that's okay. There are a lot of different ways that you can be transparent about your research process, and it can be helpful to think. At least this is the way that I've been conceptualizing it lately. Is to think about like the relationship between transparency and rigor. Um, transparency, not just in data, not just in sharing our materials, not just in sharing our coding and all of that. Transparency in the way that we approach our work is a way to both signal rigor, but also to help others confirm the rigor of your work. You're not just saying, trust me, you're saying, actually, no, here's how I did this. And I think that is something that is useful both in qualitative and quantitative research. So even if you're not a qualitative researcher and you're watching this, you might think about how some of the things that I'm about to share could also still apply to your quantitative work. But yeah, I think generally speaking, whenever we're writing an article and we want to present that work out to the world, or if we're doing like a presentation or something, the big thing that we want to know is how we can show others that our qualitative study is good, or that our work is good, that it's rigorous, and that we're not just pulling stuff out of thin air and telling you to believe us. And one of the first things that I always talk to my students about is this idea of thick description. So this is typically done throughout a paper, but it's especially done in I think I would say, well, in the introduction, but also in the method section, basically throughout the paper. But it involves a lot of descriptive information about the participants and the setting that they're in, the context in which you're collecting your data. Qualitative researchers are often interested in understanding specific phenomenon in specific settings. Generalizability isn't always at the top of their priority list. They want to understand the specific setting, so it's important to understand what that setting looks like. And this also allows then the reader to say, okay, which parts of this information that I have, might influence how generalizable or transferable these findings are to other settings. So that's one thing that you can do if you haven't been doing that. Another thing that's really big, especially for community-based and participatory research, is to describe your involvement with the community. So a lot of communities, particularly those who have had folks in research positions take advantage of their communities, might be a little bit hesitant to just let a researcher swoop in, collect their data and leave, like helicopter research, I see this described as. Um, so having that prolonged engagement with the field and community is a plus, both for building that relationship with the community, but also for better understanding and contextualizing the information that you get from that community. If you've built a relationship with that community, they may be more willing to talk to you, but also um, you might understand more some of the stuff that they reference if they're referencing specific things about that community. So then whenever you're describing it in your research study, you can learn from you've learned from that community, but then you can also hopefully accurately describe that culture, that context. And then also potentially as you're learning about that community, you might be able to anticipate potential points of confusion or misinformation. And I find this particularly helpful for my research because I often do research with gaming communities, particularly the fighting game community, and a lot of academics have literally no experience with that community. So engaging, going to weeklies where I can chat with folks and following people online and being able to really engage and talk in those communities, it helps me to understand the community, and then I can also hopefully translate that when I'm speaking in academic settings, and really figuring out, okay, what do academics or what do the general public need to know about this community in order to understand um, the findings. But it also builds credibility for me because I've taken the time to get to know that community and to understand it. um, this kind of stuff typically goes in like an intro or a method section, but depending on what it is that you're describing, it might also go in the results and discussion. Another thing that I really, really like to do is member checking. So you may be familiar with this. It's where researchers, as they're doing the data analysis, well, you might do this throughout the process. We did it in our fighting game study when we had developed a survey, and then we actually asked members of the FGC, like, do these questions even matter to your community? Are they good questions? Are any of them confusing? Is there anything that you wish that we would have asked? And so we kind of, you're checking in with the members of those communities to say, like, is this something that you're interested in? Is this something that you think is important? Is this something that people are going to respond to? What do we need to do to be able to get people to respond to this? And then throughout the process, we also continued to do that. So when we developed our code book, we shared the code book with folks in the community and said, like, you know, do you see anything that could be missing? Do these make sense? Do you feel like this definition accurately describes the theme that we've put together? Do you think these examples match? You might have a couple of examples in your code book. We typically do that. But I mean, the key thing is you're not sharing like transcripts or data with them. You're sharing like your code book, your output. And then we also, before we submit, we usually have at least one member of the fighting game community read the paper, and just kind of say, like, do you think that there's anything that we really missed or really got wrong? And what do you do with that if a member does disagree? I It could be helpful to talk to multiple members first, but if you're seeing a theme where there is kind of pushback on something, that would be something that I would report. Even, you know, if I disagree, then I would mention that. It's not saying that you have to change your results. That may be just something that you, as if you're an outsider and them as insiders, might see that issue differently. And I think you can talk about that tension in your paper. But you want to note where you have done that, and kind of what the feedback has generally been. And again, this establishes credibility for you because you're saying, like, I'm actually actively being involved with this community as a community psychologist. That's pretty important in our field. But like, you're also establishing credibility with that community, that you're not just sweeping in, collecting data and leaving, that you're not just providing your own perspective on things and then kind of letting it go, whether it's, you know, accurate to the community or not. I know within the fighting game community, there have been complaints about researchers coming in and then collecting data, and then when they present it to academics, it's very different than the way that they talked about it with the community, and there's a tension there. So it's a great way to kind of loop people back in, to keep them involved, to keep them updated on what you're finding. And especially if you're looking to build a relationship with that community to continue doing research, that's also helpful. But again, in doing that, you're being transparent about your processes, you're laying all of that out, and you're hopefully reporting that in such a way that you can kind of say, like, I'm not just doing the bare minimum here, I'm actually laying out all of the steps that I'm engaging in. Um, Another step that I find particularly helpful are external audits, which are usually done during data analysis or maybe during writing up the report. And it's most often, in my experience, I think described in the method section. But so as you're doing your data analysis, or maybe as you're writing the report, you might have somebody that doesn't have anything to do with the study, but is either familiar with the community that you're working with or familiar with the type of analysis that you're doing, to come in and actually kind of read over what you've been doing or look over what you've been doing, and to provide feedback on that. Like, does it seem like you're making claims beyond what your data says? Are you interpreting things maybe a little bit too loosely? And this can help to build more accuracy. It's also just generally useful to have somebody that isn't, you know, deep in the mire, I guess, of doing the qualitative analysis, to have somebody that's on that outside to be able to step in and kind of see, like, are you missing the forest for the trees? You know, are you too focused on one thing or another? And it can be really helpful. So it's most helpful when the auditor is not connected to the study. Um, you know, some folks talk about having the auditor being not really connected to the researcher. I think that depends on what you mean by being connected to the researcher. Sometimes in you know, theses and dissertations, for instance, the external auditor might be the chair of that committee. They're not, if they're not helping with the coding. If they're helping with the coding, they can't serve as an external auditor. But if they're not serving, if they're not also coding, they can serve as an auditor. That might not be as external as some people would like. Some people would probably like it to be somebody that's not on the committee itself. But yeah, and then one of my favorite things also to do is to look for negative cases. So where that is or what that is where you are when you're looking through and you're building your code book and you're analyzing your data and you're coding all of your work. You are looking for places where participants disagree or where something comes up that is the opposite of like what the general theme is. I find this to be particularly useful because one, it helps to get you out of that zone of where you're just looking for stuff that confirms what you're looking for. When you're actively looking for stuff that might push back on what you have defined or what you have as your general theme, I find that that can be a really useful exercise. One of the cases that where this came up was I did a study on meta-analysis on meta stereotypes. So these are stereotypes that you think that other people have about a group that you belong to. And we did this with the fighting game community. And so we asked people like what stereotypes they thought existed about their community, what the effects of those stereotypes were, and all of that. And some folks talked about accuracy. So as you might imagine, a lot of the stereotypes about gamers generally came up, but there were some that were specific to the fighting game community as well, that came up. Or were amplified. But then some folks talked about the accuracy, and this is where people differed. So, for instance, some folks talked about a lack of diversity as being, a stereotype of the group, at least as far as it refers to gender. It's a very male-dominated group. And we had participants, actually both women, talking about their experiences. One said, like, actually this community is super welcoming, and then another one had said like actually like it can be really disheartening seeing some of the comments that get made on stream and stuff like that. And so we were able to kind of present like there's some discord here, right? There are some differences here, and that it's not as easy as like all negative stereotypes about my group aren't true, right? It is a little bit more nuanced than that. And so this also engaging in this practice and then again reporting that practice out can help you just to make sure that you're being really careful about not trying to confirm all of your beliefs, and really challenging the way that you're building your case basically for your themes. And then also, I think that ideally throughout the study, and not just throughout the paper writing portion, but also through the design, the conceptualization and design, data analysis, all of that, hopefully you're engaging in reflexivity, potentially through positionality. Positionality is a good way to describe the position that you're taking as a researcher throughout the research process. So this is often described as the knower's mirror. So it's basically understanding how you yourself influence the research process and also how the research process has influenced you. If you think about why you do the work that you do, probably your answer to why do you study what you study is not people stuck a bunch of topics into a hat and I pulled one out and I decided this is what I'm dedicating my life to, right? There are probably experiences that you had or things that you found interesting or questions that you had, right? And so that led you to study what you study, and to do the work that you're doing. And probably your training influenced what kinds of methods you used and what kind of methods you deem as being credible and all of those things, right? So all of those different factors have kind of made you the researcher, and then you're also imposing that on the research process. So as somebody who was trained in both quantitative and qualitative methodologies, I'm a mixed methods researcher, right? I believe that we need to have all kinds of research. It's about asking the right question and finding the right method to match that question. And so somebody that's trained only in experimental or somebody that's trained only in qualitative might have a different view of that. Somebody who focuses more on, secondary data analysis may have a different perspective entirely. So all of those different things influence, but then there's also like personal characteristics. Like my history with the gaming community, I've been playing video games since I was 4, and I've been playing fighting games, mostly Soul Calibur growing up, and now I play like Guilty Gear and stuff like that. Those interactions that I had with the gaming community growing up influenced my interest. And in fact, as I've been reflecting over the last couple of years, initially I didn't want to do video game research because all of the research that I saw coming out of psychology was like video games make you super aggressive and then you're going to go out and kill your parents or whatever. And I was like, I don't really want to contribute to that. So I had actually marked that off as something that I didn't want to study. So you know um thinking about this, thinking about the ways that you as a person, as a researcher, might influence the research process and how this could influence potentially your results, I think is an important process. And then transparently describing that, either as an individual or you can do it also like as a lab, can be very helpful. And it is specific to that study. So it's not something that you just kind of do once and then slap up on your lab website and then like never think about again. It is a process that you should be doing with every study. And if you'd like to learn more about this specifically, this is something I'm really interested in. The Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science is having their conference next week, and we're actually running a workshop on that. So if that's something that interests you, you can come to that. Yes. So, overall, like if you want to do a general recap, um, none of these things require specialized software to do. These are all things that you can kind of build into the process of your project, regardless of whether you're using Dedoose or in vivo or Atlas TI or whatever, right? If you're going to use software though, you should really think about your needs as a lab. So that's where I wanted to talk about Dedoose, because that's what we use in our lab. It is a qualitative coding software. It's not free. It's about 11 to 15 US dollars a month, depending. There might be better deals if you talk to them. I don't know. And they do one thing that is nice is that they only charge you for the months that you use it. So if you don't use it in February, you don't get charged in February. And pretty much everything that I'm going to show you over the next few slides can be exported. I did use screenshots instead of actually directing you through the software itself, because I figured like the one day that I actually need to show it off, like it would crash or something. So screenshots it is. I apologize for that. But when you log into Dedoose, you get a project page, and so you can kind of pick the projects that you're in, and then select it, and it'll load it up. If you're starting a new project, actually let me talk about the tabs real quick. You've got this home tab, which kind of just shows, actually you'll see it on the next slide. It kind of just shows an overall look of the particular project that you're in at that moment. Codes is where I spend most of my time. It's where you apply codes and create codes. Well, it's where you create codes. Media shows the different types of files that you have in there. So if you have PDFs or video or images or anything like that, you can kind of see all of that. Excerpts, that's where you actually do the coding, so you can apply the codes there. That's also where I spend most of my time. Really, I spend most of my time in codes and excerpts. I actually don't mess with most of everything else on the software. Descriptors are where you'll find information about like demographic characteristics. Analyze it does have some data visualization-ish type functionality, which I'll show you. Memos are where you'll see any memos that you attach to excerpts while you're going through. I do consensus coding, so I've not used this, but if you're like an inter-rater reliability Kappa kind of lab, you can set up training sessions where you have specific excerpts that like everybody goes through in code, and you can kind of see like where people agree and disagree and all of that. So that's set up within the software itself. Security is about like where who you can set up to see. So if you have different project members, they can all code on that. And all of that. So one thing that is nice is that you can do things at the same time. So it's through the cloud, so it's all online. So you do need to have. I don't actually know if you can work with it while it's offline. I have not ever messed with that, but you can. Everybody has their own account, and then you can kind of see like where people are, what people are doing. So then if you're wanting to import data, so you can see here, this is the home page, so it has like some of that information in there. You can import audio, images, text, spreadsheets, and video and PDFs. I've honestly with Dedoose only ever worked with it with spreadsheets, because the big project that I've been working on for the past couple of years was a really big survey. But it's fairly easy to import. You just click on it, upload the file, and then it's there. I don't think it needs to be in any kind of particular format other than like your first row is your or all the column titles, and then the data starts after that. So like if you export something from Qualtrics, like there's like usually like 3 lines at the top, right? That you probably want to delete a couple of those, except for like whatever descriptor you want to use. And once you've imported your data, it looks like this. So you can see here the number of users is the number of people that have access to it. So it's 1 because this was a practice one. I had asked a group of people, you may have seen this if you follow me on Twitter. I asked people about a group that they belonged to, and what they liked about it and what they would change about it. So this is all real data, but it's not research data. It's not using it to publish anywhere or anything like that. You can see the descriptors. So what they counted as a descriptor was the question about what group that they were in. And so there were 28 people that responded to that. And then excerpts are going to be 1 for each question that people answered. So people were very kind, and they answered both questions about what they liked about their community and what they would change about it. So 28 times 2 is 56. We've got codes. You start out with codes for the questions. And at first I thought this was stupid, but then I realized that it can be really helpful if you use the Analyze tab. You can kind of break stuff down by like responses to specific questions. So they automatically code the responses to the questions. Yes. And code applications is the number of times all of your codes have been applied. So 28 people answered one question, 28 people answered the other question, so 56 comes up. So when you're on that descriptors page, you can kind of see, I asked people what group they belong to, and you can kind of see there's a lot of responses here. You can also see like it doesn't automatically group stuff for you. You'll especially notice that in the Analyze tab. So for this reason, I would really recommend folks, if they're going to import anything, to import a cleaned data set. So like you can see here that somebody said they belong to the group academics, and then somebody else responded to the group academia. Dedoose is going to consider those 2 separate groups, even though we can kind of understand that they're both the same. So in the Analyze tab, it's going to have those as 2 separate lines. So that's just something to consider whenever you're importing. Creating codes is pretty easy. You can do it a couple of different ways. The first way is you can go to the codes tab, click this little plus button here, and you can add a title and description. You can make it a specific color if you want to. You can also do code weighting. That is not something I've ever done, so I don't know what that ends up working like. But you can do that if that is something that you are interested in doing. And I created, for the sake of this, I created 3 codes. I made a diversity theme, and in hindsight, I really wish that I would have worded these 2 differently. But I made a diversity pro and a diversity con. We'll go with it. But diversity pro was where somebody said that that was a strength of their community, that it was diverse, and diversity con was where people said that not being diverse was a weakness of their community, something that they wanted to change. So in hindsight, I would have named those differently, but we'll go with it. As you can see, you can nest codes. You can do codes, subcodes, and all of that. I haven't had to do more than 2 levels deep, so I don't know if it goes further than that. Like, I think I've had a couple where like diversity con would have a couple of subcodes. I've not gone deeper than that, but that it handles that just fine. And so to apply codes, you can go to excerpts and you can start clicking on them. As you can see, like people, what are some things you wish would change about your group? That's one of the codes, because it's the question code. So those are automatically applied. If you want to apply a code, you can just grab it and drag it to the attached codes portion. And so then deleting it, if you're like, actually, no, I don't want to do that, you just click the X and it goes away. So it's pretty easy to apply codes. This may be less useful. It's a little bit different than how some coding software works, where you have to highlight the portions that you think that the code applies to. So if you're kind of more, I consider this more old school. I don't know that if it is or not, but if you're one of those people where you're like, I want to know specifically what phrase is applied, gets which code, then this software is probably not for you. If you're working with data where it's like fine for you to say this response mentioned this, and that's the way that you code, which is my preference over arguing with like software where there are comma not being included in the highlighting counts as a disagreement between raters, then I think Dedoose would work for you for that. But it is just a little bit different than what a lot of people might be used to with highlighting. And then if you're also, as you're working, you're like, oh, I need to add a new code. You can actually, while you're in here, click that plus sign and you get that same thing. Obviously, in your research groups, you'd be talking about themes that you care about and the relationship between them. For the purposes of this, I didn't really think too hard about the relationship between things like diversity and inclusion and racism and other isms, or whether a global community, as somebody mentioned, was a strength of theirs is necessarily a diverse community. These would be things that you would hash out with your group. But let's say that you felt like they mentioned that diversity is improving in their group, then you can include, you can create a code and include all of that. You can also create memos as you'd like. You can create a new memo, link existing memos, or you can create or share a group. So if there's a group, if you want to group your memos for any reason, and then you just start typing, and then it's saved whenever you're closed out of it. And again, you can go to the memos tab and you can see all of the memos that you've written. And then the training center, this is where you can create, you can just go down and create a new test, and then you'll select the features that you want that test to have, and then folks will apply codes, and then you can kind of see like where people agree or disagree. I haven't used this much. I think I've used it once, and that was like 4 years ago, but it can be really useful for maintaining reliability, consistency, of coding. And then you can do some analyses. This is one type of visualization that I've exported. This is a descriptor, which group they belong to, by code count table, so you can see the codes. I cleaned this up a little bit so that it would fit on one screen, but you'll notice this isn't the most beautiful analysis. It can be useful once you actually have something that's more than like 2 actual codes. So I won't say that they could probably use a little bit of work on making that analysis a little bit more visually appealing. But one thing that you'll notice is that just because something's coded with Diversity Con or Diversity Pro does not mean that they're coded with the higher level code diversity. So I'll show you that. I'll show you the general screen for analyses in a second, but I did want to point this out. So nothing got tagged with diversity specifically. So you have to kind of figure out as a group like how you want to handle that. But if you do want to do it, I'd recommend at the end, once you are done coding, you can click on, I believe it's this filter button. You can hit retroactive upcode, and then it'll pop all those codes up. It is irreversible though, so do it at the end when you feel like you're done. And then once you click, there's like a little quotation mark that'll pop up over the code. If you click on that, you can see what excerpts were coded either with Diversity Con or Diversity Pro, which is now also tagged with diversity. Here's another type of analysis that you might be able to do. I actually pulled from a different data set for this. I'm not personally a huge data visualization fan when it comes to qualitative data. I know there are really cool ways to do it. It's just not something that I tend to think about, so I don't use the Analyze tab very often. And I do think that this is something that Dedoose again could work on. I'll show you another one here in a second, but you pick an x-axis and a y-axis tag, and it'll those are like the number of people who've coded or the number of responses that get coded with that. You can size it by a descriptor, and you can also color it by a descriptor. So this is fairly random, but not terribly visually appealing. But it is a possibility if you're trying to just kind of see what relationships exist between different codes. And once you have more, the more codes you have, like the more appealing all of this is. But here is the Analyze tab. Excuse me. You can see here there are a lot of different charts that you can use. They'll show up twice, so like the descriptor by code one will show up under code and also descriptor. So you never really have to remember exactly where it is. You just need to remember what part you're looking at. But you might be interested, for instance, what percentage of codes come from people who responded a certain way or have a certain characteristic. This again is something. It's something Dedoose, I think, needs to work on this a little bit to make it truly useful for people. I can't promise that this is easier to do in like R, but I do imagine that there's a way to do these kinds of visualizations that look nicer and they're more flexible than kind of what they have here in terms of changing how this looks and what kind of information is in there. You really kind of have only these options up here. So it is kind of limited and something that they could work on improving. So you may be like, Dedoose looks cool. I'd like to try it. I think they have like a month-long trial. So if you wanted to mess with it and see what you could get out of it, you could do that. But you might find that you'd rather use something else. Thankfully, in this day and age, there are a lot of alternatives. You can always use NVivo. I would kind of ask why. To me, NVivo is like the SPSS of qualitative data. It is useful. You can do what you need it to do. And a lot of people use it, but I find it really clunky and slow to change, slow to update. And so it's not my personally preferred software. You can always still go old school. That's always still going to be free. I also find NVivo pretty expensive. But like if you're into Python tools, there's M squared C. If you're into R, there's tidytext, QCoder, and Rock. There's Luke, which I think is also not free. Atlas TI, Taget, MaxQDA. So there's a lot of alternatives out there. So it's really just useful to try things out and see see what works with your lab style, and how you do your work. Again, for Dedoose, I only really use the coding and the excerpts tabs, and I find that to be it works out for the work that we do in our lab. And I would say some important things to remember is that all of this is a process. Research is a process. I know that sometimes it can get kind of overwhelming to think about all the things that you need to be doing if you want your research to be transparent and rigorous and all of that. But you can only really do the best that you can. It is a process. There is a learning curve to all of this, and it gets easier as you do it, but it's probably never going to be fully easy. Research just generally isn't easy. So you doing even one or two things off of the list that I talked about earlier. That puts you light years ahead of the people that aren't doing it. So not every study has to be perfect. You're just doing the best that you can. And just as a reminder, again, heuristics and defaults and stuff, they could be good, but they can also be bad. And with that, thank you for coming to the talk, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you, Crystal. That was great. I have several questions, but I'm just gonna give the priority to one of the people in the audience. So this is the question from Madeline Pownell. So yeah, this is so she said this is such a great talk, and I strongly agree with you about the value and necessity of reflexivity and positionality in all research paradigms. I'm wondering what you think about the key barriers are to people embedding reflexivity into their research. Is the problem that people too often endorse the idea that their research is inherently objective and not influenced by who they are as a researcher? Or are there wider barriers in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I do think so. Quantitative research is based in the positivist paradigm of there is an objective reality. We can measure that objective reality. It doesn't really matter who's doing it as long as you follow the scientific method. Like you're gonna get the results. Anybody would get the same results as long as you're following that method. And even if I would say most quantitative researchers aren't positivists, they're trained within that framework. And so the difficulty that I have found sometimes with talking to people about positionality is like we do like to think that it wouldn't really matter that our results would come out the way that they came out because of the truth with capital T, and not with our uh, not as a result of any kinds of ways that we might have influenced the process, like the way that we ask questions, right, might solicit certain kinds of answers. And so I think that can be really uncomfortable for people to really address or to confront. And it's uncomfortable the first couple of times you do it. I also think there can be some misunderstanding from journal editors as well. Sometimes they may not understand the purpose of why you're doing that work, and also I think there might be some of that might be perceived on behalf of the researchers. They might think that their work is going to be challenged if they include their positionality or their reflexivity. Um, and I think that can be a problem. I also think sometimes people may also be hesitant um, to disclose certain aspects of themselves, right? So if you're doing LGBT research, you may not really wish to disclose all that much about your own experiences and stuff like that, which I think is a reasonable concern. That's when I think it might be great to do like a lab one that focuses on like your values as a lab. Can be really helpful. And then you can also just kind of say like members in the lab have had experience with that community. And then you don't have to really go into too much detail about that if people don't feel comfortable. I think that those are kind of the big ones. I think also sometimes people misinterpret what positionality is. Positionality is you kind of grappling with those values, with those personal statements, or those personal experiences and stuff like that. It is not like permission to do or not do certain kinds of research. It is not like I can say whatever I want because I'm a member of a specific group or whatever. It's just grappling with the way that you might have influenced the process and why that process might have influenced you. So I think sometimes there's also just a lot of misunderstanding about like what a positionality statement is and does.
Yes. So, and then another question from Jude is how would you how would you recommend describing your involvement with the community? So, for example, would it be relevant to just say that you are a member of the community? Uh-oh, you might be. Hey, John, I can't tell if I'm freezing or is Crystal.
I think she froze.
Yeah. So let's see. Let's wait for a few minutes to see if she can come back.
Uh-oh.
So everyone in the audience, we're just gonna wait for 1 or 2 minutes for Crystal to come back. Yeah, thank you for your patience. Hello.
Hi. I don't know what happened to my computer. So this is me on my phone. I apologize if the sound is a little bit messed up. So Jude asked how we'd recommend that we would describe our involvement with a community, right? Is that it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's going to depend on which community you're talking about. Whenever I talk about my involvement with gaming communities, I talk about having played video games since I was very young. I talk about the types of I used to write for a gaming magazine, so I talk about that. And then I also talk about my values that in having in allowing participants to speak for themselves, allowing communities to speak for themselves and to not speak over them. So one of the things that we try to do in our lab is to not overinterpret what participants say. So I think talking about those kinds of experiences can be very helpful. It helps to, it helps to have both an insider and outsider perspective. And I think having diversity on your lab or on your coding team can be really helpful for that. But so it's okay to have or not have experience with the community, but yeah, I would feel however you feel comfortable disclosing it, I think is a good thing to do.
So is that something that you have done, like in terms of reporting that in the manuscript itself?
Yeah, so I have a paper in the Global Journal of Community Psychology Practice about the meta stereotypes paper that I was talking about earlier. So it's something like, do they understand us? I have fighting game community member perceptions, something like that. It's kind of a long title, but we have a brief lab-based. So there were 3 people on the team, and so I had the most gaming experience. There was another member of the team that had like a little bit less, but also different communities than I do. And then one of our other community one of our other lab members had really virtually no gaming experience. And so we just talked about that and how we thought that was relevant to the paper. And it was really brief. It was only like maybe a paragraph or two in that particular paper. But some papers you might spend a long time doing that. I've seen positionality statements that are like 2 pages long before. So.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So another question. There's a lot of questions coming on, so I'm trying to make sure I get through all of them. So Derek asked, very informative talk. Thank you. Myself and other early career researchers have talked about open data. We want to do it and get better at it, but there is a worry that our mistakes will be exposed, or more experienced researchers will mock us on social media. And we have seen this done. So have you any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I would say for the people that mock you on social media, they're stupid, so don't worry about them. I know that's easier to say than to do, but I do think that like engaging in those kind of practices thoughtfully is always going to be a positive. People may not like it, but I think that it's going to be a good thing. And so you can lean on the community if you are getting harassed or made fun of or whatever. I do think that there's a community of people who are willing to be in your corner for that. In terms of like pointing out your mistakes, I mean, yeah, that's terrifying, right? But for me, it's the reason why I try to do open data when I can, is and open materials and open codes and all that kind of stuff. It is scary of the idea that somebody is going to find your stuff and find your mistake. But to me, it's less important about the fact that you've made a mistake and more important about the way that you respond to that mistake. So a lot of times it just means that you put a correction in. Okay, that happens all the time, right? Even with people that don't have open data, that happens all the time. Maybe a paper gets retracted, and that is perhaps a little bit more embarrassing, but we're also seeing some really great support for people who've had papers retracted, who were honest about the mistakes that were made, and that also happens. We're all human. So I think taking I don't think that the academic community will always do this, but I do think that kind of modeling those behaviors when you see other people retract their papers, when you see other people put in corrections and own up to their mistakes and stuff like that, praise them for it, support them through it, because it can be kind of embarrassing, but I think it's a sign of integrity. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think it's always going to be a little bit terrifying, especially for early career researchers like myself, but I think it's worth it for a better science.
Yeah, thank you. So since you mentioned like open material, so I'm just gonna sneak one questions of mine is that
Sure.
So like what would you suggest would be a good strategies to kind of track your positions and views over time and how that influence your data? Like you mentioned open notebook, is that what you usually use to kind of just keep a record of all that?
Yeah, I think a lot of folks that do qualitative research will like often have a notebook that they keep information in over time, or they might they might take notes on their on stuff. Well, stuff can be really vague, but some people like to, if they have their transcripts printed out, they might make notes on that, or they might make notes on stuff. I think having like an open lab notebook or an open study notebook and having something like that can be really, really helpful in kind of tracing your thinking back over time. I know there's a lot of debate about pre-registration in qualitative research. I think that can be useful, but I don't think that it's necessary. I think that it, in conjunction with like a lab notebook, can be really, really powerful in both. I would use it as a reflexivity tool. I would use it as a tool to kind of consider, where was I when I started this, right? And how am I changing as I'm going throughout the study.
Okay, yeah. So another question from Niraj. I really agree with your points about member checking, with ensuring that your participants feel like they are getting to really talk about their communities in an open way. Are there things that you keep in mind when engaging with communities that typically haven't been involved with research, like the I think FGC, so fighting game community? I'm
Mhm.
looking into similar kinds of research with various Discord communities, but the hard part is gaining a level of trust with the potential participants and showing them how the research could be beneficial for them. So this is also one of the questions that I have, is that do you have also some strategy that you can share with us and how to do that effectively too? Yeah.
Yeah, I think checking in often. I think checking in a lot of times. Well, I don't want to generalize too much, but I think a lot of people, especially people around my age, and perhaps some folks that are younger than me, we grew up with, for instance, with gaming communities. Like every time a shooting would happen, or every time like something like that would happen, people would be like, ah, but this person played video games. That must have been like why they engaged in violence or whatever. And yeah, I mean, I would be skeptical too, right? So I think one of the things that helped us was like showing what we were going to ask people beforehand, and saying like, this is kind of what we're asking. Is this important to you? Right? Because that's another thing, is like, you can ask people whatever questions you want, but if that community doesn't care about it, they're not going to buy into it. So that was something that we did early on, was we started reaching out to folks before we even did the survey. Once we created a draft or whatever, we sent it to several people and said, you know, are these things that the community cares about? So we made sure that the questions were relevant. And then, you know, when we sent it out on, you know, we posted it on Reddit. Game Informer covered the survey. And, you know, the responses were varied. Some people didn't trust us. One guy, I remember one person commented something like, this is the, you know, the consent form is pretty general, because we didn't want to influence the way that people would respond to the survey. So we were like, here are some questions. And they were like, maybe this is the government or something like that. And so that was very strange, but also understandable. And then some people were also just like, it's funny, like you know, we take Qualtrics and stuff like that, you know, for granted. Somebody was like, whoa, this looks so professional. And it's like, it's just a Qualtrics survey, right? So I think, and checking in with folks and sharing, like we would share posters that we'd made with the community for like conferences and answer questions. And so that can also be a way to educate people about like the research process. Like at one point, somebody was like, you know, there are a lot of white people in this survey, because the FGC is known for being really racially diverse. I think our sample of people who responded, it's like 50% white or something like that. I don't remember exactly which percentage it is, but and they were like, that seems pretty high. And so we got to talk about like, well, a third of people didn't provide their demographics. So this isn't necessarily an accurate picture of who even filled out the survey. It's just like what we had, right? And so then we got to talk about like the importance of you know, providing the demographic, you know, information. And then that also was a clue to us that like when we ask these questions in the future, like maybe we should note that like this, why we want that information, right? So that can also be, you know, a helpful tool to like build that trust. So like just really trying to think about it through their lens. Like if they're part of a community where people have made money off of doing research on them, but they've never seen any of that money, then think about like how you might help to further that community's economic development. Or if they don't trust you because research has been really poor about that community, think about like explaining more what the steps are and stuff, and why you're doing what you're doing, and that can really help.
And then another question from, I'm sorry if I pronounce your name wrong, Lakshmi. So as a beginner, I feel that the lines between different paradigms can be blurry, and the methodology or theory driving it can be vague. But to ensure transparency, we should be reporting on them. How do we commit when we are unsure of the theories and the paradigms ourselves?
Oh, that's interesting. Let me rejoin on my computer real quick, and then I will answer that question.
Here I am. Okay. So yeah, I think it's an evolving thing. I think one thing that can be really helpful is to just take some time out, take a step. I think sometimes we're really afraid to do this in research, but just maybe sometimes we can just stop and take a step back and say, well, let me do some reading. So, a lot of the better qualitative textbooks will actually have a section on different research paradigms. It can be really helpful just talking with folks and kind of just figure out like where you fit in all of that. And also note that it may be different for different projects. Like some projects I tell my students that it tends to fall under 3 umbrellas. And I don't know if a philosopher of science would agree with me on these umbrellas, but there's a positivist framework. There is an objective reality. We can measure that objective reality. And it really doesn't matter who's doing the research. Interpretivist umbrella is like, there is an objective reality. We should strive for objectivity, but like we're always going to be limited to varying degrees of our own personal perspectives. And then the transformative paradigm umbrella, which is the question of what's objective and subjective is stupid. We should really be fighting for justice. We just need to acknowledge that whenever we create a dichotomy, we're going to put one of those dichotomies of, one of those two pieces above the other. So we put objective above subjective. We put hard sciences above soft sciences. We put, like, anytime we do those two things, we're going to put one over the other. And who tends to get hurt by that? Marginalized communities, right? They're seen as subjective. They're seen as having a horse in the race or whatever. And so the question of objectivity and subjectivity is kind of a moot point because we're constructing our reality, and just because something is there doesn't mean that it's natural and that we can fight to change it. So like I tell people, like, there's a whole bunch of spectrums underneath all of this, and like for some projects you might take more of an interpretivist lens, some projects you might take more of a transformative lens. It all kind of depends. So it can be really helpful to think about where you fall. Like, are there things that are true regardless of who's looking at it, or are we are most things or all things that we kind of agree on as a society are true or not true? How do we integrate that new information, and are we interested in describing or changing? So I think like even just asking yourself those kinds of questions, I think, can go a long way. But always reading's great.
And then the same person also asked the questions, what are the ethical concerns with open data, especially with data derived from vulnerable communities and population groups for example, also in medical setting, are there ethical concerns these are a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah, I would absolutely. I am hesitant to share qualitative data generally, because you never know what. I think when I actually let me step back. I am generally hesitant unless I'm absolutely sure that it's going to be okay. And the reason why I'm hesitant is because you never know when somebody's going to bring something up that they either don't want to share or don't want to run the risk of being identified, even if it seems innocuous to you, right? It could be something that's very meaningful to that participant. And also if sometimes, and it depends, sometimes people may be more hesitant to share if they think that their interview is going to get plastered all over the internet. Even if that's just the perception of theirs, right? Because reality is probably not a lot of people are going to dig through data sets and all of that, right? But like the risk is still there, and that can be very, very meaningful. And I don't think that should be discounted. And I think it often tends to be discounted by folks where re-identification isn't really going to be a huge issue. So like if I did a campus climate survey or like interviews or something on my campus at USI, re-identification of cis white female psychology student, the risk for that's probably not very high. But the risk on a campus where there's like, I think 3 to 5% of our population is Black, and we're not a huge school. And if you say Black male engineering student, right? That's probably going to really limit, like, you probably, if you're familiar with engineering students, you probably know who that student is, or you can have a pretty good guess, right? So so re-identification that risk is not equally applied to every group, so that's something to consider. And then also just there may be stuff that people just don't want out there if they're sharing their personal experiences or whatever. But like we also, for instance, asked some of our fighting game community members, who are some, we didn't ask them to necessarily name names, but we told them they could if it made it easier to talk about it. Like, who do you look up to in the community, or like who do you avoid in the community? So like, they could have told us anything, right? They could have told us personal information, not about themselves, but about somebody else. And then that person is also not consenting for that information to be online about them. So I think that there's, potentially a lot of risk, especially when you're collecting data from marginalized communities, especially when you're collecting sensitive data about things like sexual assault and harassment and health data and all of that kind of stuff. And that's why I'm generally hesitant. I don't have a hard rule against it, but I'm generally hesitant because there's maybe information in there that people aren't actually consenting to giving, or they may not fully understand like why that data is being shared. So if you are going to share data, you need to be really, really careful. Like I know some people will do a consent at the beginning and at the end. So then people can kind of think about, okay, what did I just say? Am I okay with that being publicly posted, or do I want that to be private? But there's also kind of a happy middle, which I'm pretty pleased about, is that both on the OSF and then also in like other qualitative data repositories, you can set it up where the data is on the repository, but then people have to request to be able to access it. And so as long as you have a clearly delineated policy, I think that can be really helpful. So like maybe they need to have IRB approval or something like that. You can maybe make everything else open, your code book, your materials, like the questions that you asked, stuff like that. And then maybe people can submit like an IRB or an ethics board application, and then come to you and get the data. But that also puts an extra bit of responsibility on you, that you need to be responding to those emails if those requests. So.
Well, that's really helpful. I've never really thought about those issues before, since I'm mainly a quantitative researcher. But so is that because I know that when I read a qualitative paper, usually they would have like a quote, like pretty long quote from the participant too. So is that usually, I just assume that the participant would have been asked that,
Not
like,
not
or
necessarily, but usually
okay,
qualitative researchers are pretty careful about, like, when we think about a quote to use for a theme, we think about like, how good does this quote represent what we're trying to say, but also like, is there anything in this bit that could be identifiable? And then we'll censor anything if it's like, if we think that, like, if they say here in city state, I tend to do this, then we actually, you will take the city and the state out, and try to anonymize it as much as possible while retaining the essence of the quote. I don't know how others do it, but that's generally how we approach it. Is that the quote is good at kind of highlighting the theme, but we still want to make sure that we're not like saying, I, Crystal Steltenpohl, am saying that blah 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 blah.
so I want to follow up on that because I did mention that I deal mainly with quantitative data. So now I'm start to just explore it a little bit with qualitative data. And the approach so far just kind of just use qualitative data to complement quantitative. Do you see any strengths in doing that to kind of, is that like, honestly, I haven't seen papers that kind of report both, but do you see that add any values to the quantitative data or not?
Oh yeah. I that's mostly what I do. Well, I have whether the qualitative or the quantitative is the driver kind of flips back and forth for me. But for instance, in our meta stereotypes paper, we asked people, how understood or misunderstood do you feel by these communities? And so it was non-fighting game play, like gamers, people who don't play games, gaming media, and non-gaming media. And we wanted to see if like their levels of feeling understood by those communities differed, because usually people just ask like, do these people understand you? And so we were like, does it maybe vary across groups? And so that was a quantitative question, or those were quantitative questions. But then that doesn't super tell you a lot. Like, people feel like they're misunderstood. That's great, but like there's a lot more that you could do with that, right? So we asked them like, what what are these perceptions that other groups have of you? And then like we were able to code and see like if the perceptions changed. But also we asked them, why do these perceptions exist? And so we saw that the motivations, or if you want to call that, or the reasoning for why these exist, they differed by group as well. So they thought that the media was interested in clicks, whereas you know, and advertising money and stuff like that, but individual people were more interested, you know, they maybe just haven't had exposure to the community, or they you know, they're ignorant in other ways, or they're relying on stereotypes, whereas they found I guess you could say more nefarious reasons were given to the media than to individual people. So you can ask a lot of good follow-up questions and really get into the why. Why do these ratings exist? Yeah, people feel misunderstood or understood, but why do they feel that these groups are different? Is I think really helpful. So qualitative, I find, can get to a lot of the how, the why, the affective sort of emotional component of whatever it is that you're looking at. And it can also be helpful to check definitions. A lot of times gaming researchers will say, well, if you play X number of hours a week, like you're a gamer. But when you actually ask people who play games, like, what does it mean to be a gamer? They don't, some people do talk about how many hours a week you play games, but mostly it's other stuff. So if you're not talking about of something in the same way that your participants are talking about something, that can really challenge like the validity of your research. So I think that those kinds of things can be really, really insightful.
Yeah, thank you. So so we almost 15 minutes past the time. So and so I'm just gonna wrap up, but you can see in the Q&A that everyone say thank you and the response very positive, and really thank you for your time today.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions or they'd like to chat further, I just put my email in the chat. And then also you can follow me and ask questions on Twitter. I love talking about this stuff. So yeah, I'd happy to chat. Thank you guys for having me. And yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And then all the material will be available on OSF too, and this, including the video recording of this. Yeah, thank you, Crystal. Hope you have a
Thanks.
nice weekend.
Thanks, you too.
Bye-bye.